the key thing we have to remember that what happened in AUSMIN is a negotiated outcome that both sides agreed to.
You're listening to the USSC Briefing Room, a podcast from the United States Study Centre at the University of Sydney, where we give you a seat at the table for a USSC briefing on the latest developments in US news and foreign policy. We'll cover what you need to know and what's beneath the surface of the news.
Hello everyone, I'm Victoria Cooper, Research Editor at the United States Study Centre. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we're recording on today. The University of Sydney is located on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and future. Welcome to this episode of the USSC's Briefing Room, the Centre's podcast that gives you a seat at the table for a briefing on all the latest in news and foreign policy. In today's briefing, we'll be hearing from two of our experts in foreign policy and defence to discuss all the latest developments in the Australian and US maritime domain. I'm joined by the United States Study Centre Director of Foreign Policy and Defence, Professor Peter Dean. Peter, welcome back to the podcast. You're basically a seasoned guest at this point. It's great to have you sharing your insights with us again.
Always good to be here.
And we're also joined by Research Fellow in the Foreign Policy and Defence Program, Blake Herzinger, who is joining us from Singapore. Welcome to the USSC Briefing Room.
Thanks for having me, Victoria. Long-time listener, first-time caller.
There you go. It's great to have you both. And there's lots to discuss, but as we have a little tradition on the podcast, at the end of each episode, we try and get our guests to give us a numbers, fact or statistic, some kind of figure or fun fact that's caught your attention recently. So are you guys good to go on that?
Good to go.
Good to go. I've got thumbs up.
Ready.
Fantastic. Let's dive in. So we're here to talk about some of the developments in the foreign policy and defence space because the pace of announcements has been intensifying over recent weeks. We've just had AUSMIN over the weekend before we've recorded this episode. The Talisman Sabre joint exercise between Australia, the United States, and I think it's 13 other nations. We've also seen the recent commissioning of the USS Canberra. I always go to say USSC Canberra, but USS Canberra, which is a naval ship, and that also really caught my eye. So Blake, I might begin with you. A lot of your work focuses on maritime security and sea power. You're a serving US Navy research foreign officer. You were an advisor to the US Pacific Fleet. You've worked on maritime security cooperation in Southeast Asia, South Asia, and the South Pacific, and you developed the Indo-Pacific Maritime Security Initiative program. So you're absolutely the perfect person to ask this question. So there's been a lot of recent defence announcements, a lot of geopolitical developments. They all have us talking about naval powers, about ports, shipping routes, submarines, island chains, all these terms. But I wonder if you could explain for us what actually is maritime security and why is it getting so much attention at this point in time?
No, that's a great question, Victoria. And the pithy answer is that maritime security is all of those things, or it's whatever of those things gets you budget at the time that is important to you. So it's a maybe winked at secret that across the world, every country looks at maritime security differently. We all have different concepts, different ways of laying it out. But when you drill down to it, most countries define it as this kind of all-encompassing grab bag of all things under the water, on the water, above the water. Some people break it into sort of non-traditional and traditional security, which on the non-traditional side, we'd be talking about humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. We'd be talking about fisheries patrols, law enforcement, border patrolling. And then on the quote-unquote traditional side, then we're talking about gray-hulled warships, missiles, bombs, aircraft. But that definitional split gets really difficult when you start talking about countries that traditionally deal with non-military challenges at sea more than they do, more than they fight naval warfare. These are, especially in the South Pacific, in Southeast Asia, these countries are dealing with constabulary issues day in, day out, not necessarily high-end naval warfare. So for them, it's very much traditional to be worried about fisheries and anti-narcotics patrolling and that kind of thing. And right now in the region, we're dealing with a lot of maritime threats that bleed across into various EEZs on the high seas. And all these countries are trying to get their arms around how to patrol these commons, how to ensure good order at sea. And that's also bringing elements of national power into friction at sea. So we're seeing national competition at the same time as we're seeing illicit and illegal behavior at sea.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks. That's really, really helpful. So as I mentioned, we had AUSMIN and there was an announcement of intent to rotate US Navy Marine Patrol and Reconnaissance aircraft in Australia to enhance regional maritime domain awareness. So what does that actually practically mean? Is it sort of the same rotation that we're seeing with troops in Darwin, that kind of established agreement between the United States and Australia? What would that practically look like?
Yeah, so this is something that's actually near and dear to my heart. So I was an intelligence officer attached to a maritime patrol and reconnaissance squadron for my first job in the Navy, probably longer ago than I'd like to think about. And it would be, conceptually, yes, similar to the Marines Rotational Force Darwin, bringing these planes from their traditional deployment sites, particularly in Japan and in Japan's southern islands and northern islands, and bringing them into the region, because really you can only fly so far, even if you start from Okinawa. If you fly from Okinawa, these planes can get down to the South China Sea, but they can't spend that much time there before they have to return for fuel. If you have a detachment site in somewhere like Singapore or the Philippines, that gives you a lot more time on station, is how they would phrase that. And then coming from Australia, you could spend more time in areas that are of key importance to the alliance, and you can do a lot more work between Australian P-8s, US P-8s, things like combined anti-submarine warfare operations, a lot more training opportunities, and just kind of that practice flying together and around each other that the US has with Japan already, and gaining that kind of experience with Australia will be key.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay, that's really clarifying. Pete, I might bring you into this conversation. Something I looked at AUSMIN was that the whole affair is quite chummy. We hear a lot of terms like mateship and friendship and the unbreakable alliance. And it's clear our two countries, the United States and Australia, we're very willing to work closely together. There's a lot of trust. But at the same time, I've also seen this kind of reticence about some of this language, about things like the unbreakable alliance, about mateship. And at the same time that we saw all these like nice chummy statements, I also saw some grumbling from some critics saying, looking at the AUSMIN statement and saying that it's locked Australia into US military strategy, that, Australia's become a client state of the US. So what do you say to that and that sort of criticism? Are there risks to Australia's sovereignty and independence when we partner so closely to the United States on these sort of defence arrangements?
Thanks for the question. Look, it's a really good question. It's a very pertinent question at the moment. It hasn't been this type of discussion around our relationship with the United States like this for a very long time. And I think that it's stoked by some genuine fears about the direction that the regional security environment's going in. And in alliances, we talk about a classic dilemma is entrapment and abandonment. And for a very long period of time, when we spoke about our alliance with the United States, particularly during the Cold War, the real concern was, would we be abandoned in our time of need? What if a regional security crisis affected Australia, prop up? Would the United States be there to help us? And I think as the international security environment's changed, particularly in the Indo-Pacific, with the rise of China and strategic competition in the region, and a very big focus, for instance, on the future of Taiwan and how that issue will be resolved and if that would come to force. Largely now you see a lot of the public commentary around our relationship is around entrapment. Are we getting entrapped in a potential conflict in the Indo-Pacific because of our relationship with the United States? I think if you drill these back into basic things, it's sovereignty is about the ability to make choices as a state. And what I would fundamentally say is that the alliance we have with the United States of America is a choice that our politicians and our public make every day. Every day the politicians get up and decide, like not actively, they're not making a decision and writing something down, but there is a calculation there, is if this still in our net interest to our country. And every day that's happening. And I think what's happening in recent times, because of the rising threat to the security environment, they're actually thinking it's becoming even more and more important. And AUKUS is one of these things. For instance, there's been a lot of criticism of AUKUS as well. But fundamentally, you've got to remember, AUKUS is a choice that we made as a state. We went to the United States, we went to the United Kingdom and asked for help to get a nuclear-powered submarine capability. I've heard people say, well, we're the only ones paying money out to the United States. I'm like, we're the only one getting a capability in return. Yeah. Like we're going to be one of the few navies in the world that operate this level of capability, which in my personal view is the preeminent naval capability in the world now. Once upon a time, battleships were the preeminent combatant, then aircraft carriers, and I personally believe, particularly in our region, that it's submarines and particularly nuclear-powered submarines. if you look at the statistics, that there's overwhelming public support for the relationship with the United States. The government on both sides has been very clear about deepening that relationship in response to the threat of what's happening in the strategic environment. And I think some of this is driven by genuine fears and concerns that we all have about conflict in our region. But I think it has to be contextualised within that. Really, this is about most alliances around about the balance of power, or most often the balance of threat. And we know that the threat is rising. China's become much more powerful. It's become much more assertive. It's not doing things very opaquely. It's being willing to threaten to use force, or actually use force to change international rules and standards and norms, and change the regional balance of power. And this is, I think, a deepening of the relationship with the United States. As AUSMIN also pointed out, a deepening of relationship with Japan is because these countries in particular have mutual interests. And I did a report that I did with some colleagues that came out in December last year, where we actually tried to go beyond the polling data and run workshops with members of the Australian community and ask them some of these very questions. And overwhelmingly, mateship was not a term they like to use. I have to say the unbreakable alliance was a term that didn't resonate with the Australian population, because nothing's unbreakable. But what resonated with the Australian public is the relationship matters when our interests coincide with the United States interests. And I think what is really clear, what we're seeing at the moment, that is happening in our region in response to the changing security threats that we're facing. And I said the key thing we have to remember, that what happened in AUSMIN is a negotiated outcome that both sides agreed to. So that's Australian agency. That's not us doing what the Americans tell us to do. That is us exerting our sovereignty as a country, our politicians exerting that sovereignty, just as we made a sovereign decision as a nation to pursue AUKUS in nuclear-powered submarines. So I think that's the key context that we have to view that question in.
Yeah, fantastic. And talking a bit about those sovereign capabilities and Australia's capabilities, Pete, not only are you the director of the Foreign Policy and Defence Program at the Centre, but you've served a number of positions around military and defence studies and policy advising, and you were recently the co-lead on the 2023 Defence Strategic Review, and that basically lays out the agenda for reform for defence's posture and structure. So how do you see some of these recent developments, be it at AUSMIN or around the Talisman Sabre, or new contracts that we've been seeing in recent weeks? Are we making progress against, to defend ourselves against some of these threats that you've outlined, and what challenges remain?
Yeah, well, it's been a big couple of weeks, as you said at the top of the show. And look, all of these I think have been very positive outcomes. So the outcome of the Land 400 Phase 3 decision has been a long time coming. That's a contract that had been under negotiation, put on hold while it was reconsidered by the DSR, and we came out with a capability number of 129. And I have to say, we've got to give Army in particular here, and Defence more broadly, but particularly the Chief of Army and the Head of Land Capability, General Vag, who worked extraordinarily hard, because DSR only dropped in mid-February. Then by the time that was accepted by government, it's been a very short period of time to actually renegotiate that contract on Land 400, get a solution and an outcome passed through Cabinet, making an announcement and decisions. And what I'm really pleased to see is that these vehicles will be built in Australia. Now, both companies, Rheinmetall and Hanwha, would have been great companies for the Australian Defence Force to work with. We already work with Rheinmetall, obviously, on the combat reconnaissance vehicles. But I was also super pleased to see that a South Korean company got this contract. They're doing our self-propelled howitzers. It's a great capability, and it's going to be built here in Australia. So that's a very big step forward. AUSMIN, well, I would be biased because I worked for Sir Angus Houston and Stephen Smith on the Defence Strategic Review. But I read AUSMIN, I looked at that communique, and what stood out to me was force posture initiatives, which were key in the DSR, work on RAAF bases in Sherga and Curtin, and a key element out of DSR that the government agreed to and made one of their priorities was that northern base network. And we've seen a lot of work done in Tyndall and Darwin, but Sherga and Curtin are really important bases. More work on guided weapons and explosive ordnance, including the manufacturing of weapons in Australia in the next 2 years. More work on regional partnerships, a lot about the Pacific, which was fantastic. Space, which was a key part of the DSR, and we've got a report by Tristan Moss coming out very soon with the Centre on the Alliance Space Policy and space becoming a force posture initiative. Maritime security that Blake was talking about before being a big focus. I was really super excited to see that part of the US force posture was bringing the US Army watercraft out to Australia to work with our Army, and littoral manoeuvres are a key focus for our Army out of DSR. And integrated air and missile defence, that's a really, really key part of the future of defence and the risk management environment, really key and that's been done trilaterally with Japan, the United States and Australia work on that. So I think these are all things that were highlighted in the DSR. So to me, this has been an AUSMIN that is really delivering on some of the key features of the Defence Strategic Review, which I know from our time in the US and stuff has received really positive feedback from the US government. And so this is the US government also leaning in, supporting us to deliver our own capabilities under our own defence review, them supporting our sovereign decisions. So I think that's been it's been a really positive couple of weeks. Talisman Sabre is a fantastic exercise. The strength of the increased number of collaborators and the increased size of this over the years is really important. But of course, we've seen a very tragic outcome as a part of Talisman Sabre with the loss of a Taipan helicopter and the 4 crew. That shows you the types of risks that not only our Defence Force members do, but those involved in these types of exercises. They're very high-end, they're very complex. Blake's been involved in a lot of them personally. I've been lucky enough to go and observe a few and be involved. And there are risks like that every minute of every day by every nation involved being undertaken. And that's part of the thing that we should always remember, that even in a time of relative peace, that our defence members undertake very high-risk activities to provide deterrence. And deterrence is really at the core not only of our defence strategy, but that of the United States, Japan and other countries in the region too.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really potent reminder at this time. Thanks, Pete. We've had several new appointments in the US Navy. The Biden administration nominated the current Vice Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Lisa Franchetti, to be the next Chief of Naval Operations, which makes her the second woman ever to achieve the rank of 4-star Admiral in the US Navy. And when confirmed, she'll be the first woman to serve as the Chief of Naval Operations and on the Joint Chief of Staff. And we're also seeing a new lead for the US Indo-Pacific Command, or Indo-PACOM. And so I suppose I have 2 questions, and Blake, I'll ask you. Firstly, what is the significance of these appointments? And then what are the major challenges confronting these 2 servicemen and women?
There's been a lot of churn around this nomination. There was a leak, effectively, that saying that Admiral Paparo was being taken from U.S. Pacific Fleet to be made the new CNO. And now that was something that is definitely non-standard. No one was expecting PAC Fleet to go to CNO. Usually we see PAC Fleet go up the hill and take on the Indo-Pacific Command job, which currently is being done by Admiral Aquilino. So what is normal is to see the Navy running Pacific Fleet and the Navy running U.S. Indo-Pacific Command. So this leak indicating that Admiral Paparo would move across and back to Washington, D.C., really threw a spanner into the works in terms of kind of upsetting the normal succession line and what that normally looks like. So it introduced some questions surrounding who would take that job. It sort of opened a window for a very, very short period of time and introduced some speculation on whether the Army would actually try to get an Army general into that job for the first time. And so there was a lot of kind of uproar about this. And it was all kind of nebulous. No one really knew who had leaked this information. No one really knew what was behind it. And so that's all been put to bed now. Admiral Paparo will remain in Hawaii. He will go on to Indo-Pacific Command, and Admiral Franchetti will take over as CNO. Now, Admiral Franchetti, I've never worked for her, but she has a stellar reputation across the Navy. I've never heard a bad word about her. She has commanded a carrier strike group. She's commanded a fleet staff. She's been serving as VCNO. She is intimately familiar with the challenges facing the U.S. Navy at this moment, and she's served for years now with our current CNO, Admiral Gilday, who will be departing. So part of what we're dealing with now, though, is that we don't know when those appointments will be made because of some unique congressional wrangling that's happening with one congressman in particular holding up appointments of flag officers and general officers. So we're actually heading into a very strange period where if something doesn't change by the end of August, we will have 3 services inside the U.S. joint enterprise that do not have service chiefs. That is a troubling scenario for all involved. The Democrats are also searching for a way to kind of get these appointments through. But I think at the last count, There's several hundred officers waiting for approval. They usually batch these together, and to do them one at a time would take 84 straight days of congressional work to do those things. So basically, Congress would do no other work for almost 3 months just to get these appointments through. So this is sort of the environment we're in. Now, of course, that hang-up is something that is attached to domestic policy surrounding reproductive health. So we're dealing with a lot of big issues, some of which are very, very domestic-oriented, which are now affecting kind of the outward-facing military capabilities and leadership at the highest levels. So where does this kind of come in? What kind of ripple effect does this cause? We'll have an acting CNO, we'll have an acting, commandant of the Marine Corps. They won't be issuing like their real planning guidance. They won't be implementing kind of personal vision on the organization. It'll sort of be like operating under when our government operates under a continuing resolution, right? The organization functions, but it's not 100%. You're not growing, you're not expanding, you're not implementing vision. You're just kind of existing day to day. So, right now in kind of this shifting security environment that Pete already mentioned, that's a problem. You're sort of taking a knee at a time where you should be implementing vision and growing and thinking. And instead, we're trying to figure out how do we deal with this issue of succession and chain of command. And that also, up and down the chain in a very nitty gritty fashion, people can't move, right? You can't move to take your next job. You can't get the next guy out of the way. So people's careers start backing up, and it's this sort of accordion effect up and down the chain of command. So that is sort of the significance of and maybe the major challenge confronting both of those people at the moment. Now, on the Admiral Paparo side, moving into Indo-Pacific Command, he is, again, intimately familiar with the challenges being faced by the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Having just been out in Honolulu myself about a month ago, I can say, Admiral Paparo is very, very tuned into those. He is leading from the front. He has a vision and he is implementing it. Now, it's a vast challenge, and I think you're going to see a lot of work being done between Admiral Franchetti and Admiral Paparo to face those challenges and to help the Navy get on the right footing to deal with them. And then as Admiral Paparo's Indo-Pacific Command, helping the entire joint enterprise work together and integrate to take on those challenges, because we are seeing new requirements for, the Army figuring out how it works in the Pacific. I, too, was very, very encouraged seeing Army watercraft included in the AUSMIN joint statement. That's a capability that our Army has tried to divest several times in the last 5 years. Whether they were going to buy new ones or not, we don't know. But Congress told them, no, you will not sell those boats. They went back and said, okay, we won't sell the boats, but hey, we're selling the boats. So it's been a real battle trying to get everyone sort of on the same page. So seeing those going forward and getting them implemented and working together with Australian forces to work on things like littoral maneuver is key. So very, very encouraged by seeing that included in this year's AUSMIN.
Yeah, a real positive development from AUSMIN, but also a big reminder of the ways that US domestic politics impacts its foreign policy and then also its alliance partners around the world, including Australia. I hear you alluded to your trip to Honolulu, and before I want to ask you both on your recent travels. But before I do that, Pete, I'd love you to put on another one of your many career hats as a bit of a historian. And we recently saw the commissioning of the USS Canberra, not USSC, USS Canberra in Sydney. And it got a lot of attention and a big audience. And I wonder if you could shed some more light on why this particular ship is significant, and also tell us a little bit more about the name of the ship.
Well, first of all, I would actively encourage the boss to look into a USSC Canberra. I'm sure we could all do, being here in Sydney near the beautiful harbour. I'm not sure a littoral combat ship from the US Navy is exactly the type of vessel that we'd be looking for. But once upon a time, another part of my career was at UWA, and I got to UWA just after they sold the UWA yacht, which I was really unimpressed about. So maybe we could talk about a USSC Canberra yacht. For the centre. I think that's fantastic. Look, this is a really interesting story. USS Canberra, who was just commissioned, is the first US Navy vessel to be commissioned not in the United States, the first one to be done overseas. It was also the original Canberra, and this is the second warship to be named Canberra in the US Navy. It was the first US warship named after a foreign city. This is because the Australian and US navies fought the Battle of Savo Island off Guadalcanal during a really pivotal campaign in 1942 in the South West Pacific. Again, an area that's once again a part of strategic competition. During that battle, we got seconded by the Imperial Japanese Navy. They did a much better job. They sunk a number of US warships, as well HMAS Canberra was sunk during the Battle of Savo Island as well. So the original, what was going to be the USS Pittsburgh, which was a heavy cruiser, the same class of HMAS Canberra, was decided by the US president to be renamed to be the USS Canberra after the HMAS Canberra was sunk during the Battle of Savo Island. She entered service the following year in 1943. She was a heavy cruiser, and she actually had a very, very long storied history. So she was at the Battle of Okinawa, she was involved in the Cuban Missile Crisis. She served 5 tours during the Vietnam War. She was reconstructed as a guided missile cruiser later on in her career. And eventually she was decommissioned in the early 1970s and struck off the register in the late 70s. So from 1943 to, technically speaking, on the US Navy list to 1978, it's a pretty long storied career. This time we haven't got a big heavy cruiser. We've got a littoral combat ship, a much smaller vessel, but vessels that particularly are very focused on operating in this part of the region. Blake there in Singapore has he'll correct me, there's 1 or 2 littoral combat ships that are sort of on rotation that work their way through Singapore as well. So, and this is a class of vessel, this sort of offshore patrol vessel, littoral combat ship that our Navy has also been working on, that the DSR calls for an emphasis on a sort of a larger number of smaller vessels in our Navy fleet mix. So that's sort of what we call Tier 1, the big destroyers and frigates need to be there, but also a larger number of what the DSR calls the Tier 2 surface combatant. And they're because of the nature of the very littoral archipelagic region around us, but also the move to the very large numbers of ships that the Chinese Navy is developing. And, there is something important about quantity as well as quality of your vessel, but also smaller vessels have smaller crew. They can pack quite a lot of punch these days, and they can do a lot of your presence and diplomatic engagement. And one of the things about navies is they operate under the full spectrum of conflict, from high-end warfighting, but also naval diplomacy is a really key part of an extension of our foreign policy of any country and of our presence in the region and our ability to cooperate with our neighbours and partners, particularly, again, the DSR's focus on our maritime allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific, which is a region dominated by water and the maritime environment. So it's a fascinating story. It is one of those symbolic things that reflect the close relationship of the United States and Australian navies. Even having Blake in the team reflects that, doesn't it? That we've got a US Navy officer that we're willing to work with here at USSC. So, look, a really interesting, really nice that
take that as a compliment.
Yeah, that we were able to do that, and I think are really powerful. It's one of those symbols, along with we were saying before, the use of the phrases mateship or friendship. And, I said, I'm really not a fan of the unbreakable alliance, but these things do matter as symbols of how effectively close the relationship is. And working on those types of things is reflective of the longevity of the partnership as well. But it's an interesting story and a really interesting moment, both in history, but in the current strategic relationship between the two countries as well.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay, I want to read your travel diaries. Both of you have been to really interesting places. Blake, I might start with you. Could you tell us a bit about where you've been and if you have any highlights or observations, any thoughts or reflections?
Sure. Yeah, and I'll start from the beginning. About a month ago, I was in Honolulu in my under my reservist hat, working on a combined exercise actually with the ADF. So the U.S. and Australian forces in Hawaii, working on issues of interoperability and Indo-Pacific security. So it was really a kind of a heartwarming moment, actually, kind of sitting side by side with our Australian counterparts, kind of in these tents, working on issues. And really, you spend a lot of time complaining about the same things, struggling to log on to the same computers that don't work, trading stories about how it's the same at home. But these are sort of the moments where you actually build some of that camaraderie and build these connections. Actually, I'm sitting at my desk. I have all these cards from across the RAN and the Army, folks that I met that we worked well together. We enjoyed it. We built friendships, but we also looked at key issues and we thought about things and we exchanged views. It should be no surprise that we probably both came away learning a lot of things or seeing things a different way. And as Pete mentioned, I actually find this a lot at USSC. A lot of times where I kind of, I'm politely and gently reminded that is a great American perspective. Here is another perspective, maybe from a point of view, maybe an Australian one, and it's continual learning from me. And I've been in Singapore for about 10 years now, working on alliance-related issues, and there's always something to learn. There's always an opportunity to be to try and adopt a kind of a more humble mindset and learn something from a partner and see your own policy from a different standpoint. Like, hey, look, these things seem like great ideas where you're coming from, but we might see it a different way. So coming away from Pacific Century, I actually was really recharged and really came away with even more enthusiasm for our alliance. Great experience. I came home for a little bit and then I spent 2 weeks in DC, where again, the US-Australia alliance is kind of the first thing that people want to talk about. It is on everyone's minds. There is, I think, a lot of institutional energy to get after key problems. I think we're seeing a lot more attention being paid to things like technology transfer, industrial policy, things like this that traditionally aren't, the sexy headline items, but now we're seeing it. Like, hey, if you want to talk about building submarines together, there's a lot of issues that we, from the Australian side, hey, we've been asking about these things for a long time. And if you think this is going to work, we got to solve these problems. And I think you're seeing attention being paid to those things in new ways and by more people, which is great. And it was really encouraging to see. Always really energizing to kind of be in DC and be around where things are happening and these policies are being made. And it's good to bring a perspective from far away because it's, there's no easy way to get to Washington, D.C., especially from here. If you're going back and forth, you're spending half your life in airplanes. So I came away from those things ready to get back to work here. Really looking forward to coming down to Australia later in the year. And I don't know, I'm just very enthusiastic to be part of this team. It was also, on a side note, walking through kind of the halls of the Pentagon, and I looked far away and I left my glasses away, so I probably squinted pretty extremely at someone coming toward me, and it was a kind of familiar face, but kind of a smudge at that distance, and I realized it was Mike Green. So I actually met the boss in the Pentagon for the first time face to face, which was a funny little Pentagon moment, going all the way to the other side of the world to meet my boss who lives in Australia.
That's fantastic. I mean, there's so much to be said for communication and keeping those lines of communication open between alliance partners and sharing perspectives. Yeah, that's fantastic. Also hilarious that you met Mike in the Pentagon, as you do. Was he in the gift shop?
That's right. No, but I just had been.
There you go.
It's the best part of the Pentagon.
It is the best part of the Pentagon. We can attest. It was fantastic. Pete, was your trip, you went to Germany and Bulgaria. Was that tense and struggle or something a bit different?
Absolutely. So, I went to the other side of the globe to Blake. I was very lucky enough, and I was a guest of the Talisman group, so the shipbuilder. They've obviously got a contract building the offshore patrol vessels for the Australian Navy. And they took myself, some colleagues from ASPI, from Defence Connect, from the Australian Defence Magazine and stuff over to have a look at their shipyard in Germany, in Hamburg, and look at their corvettes. So as I said, the government's, as a part of the Defence Strategic Review, has an independent analysis team working on at the moment. For full declaration, while I worked on the DSR, I have no idea what's happening in that independent analysis of the surface fleet. I've not met them and don't know what their terms of reference are or what they're doing. But they know from the direction that we know in the public version of the DSR, looking at a Tier 2 surface combatant. And one of the questions that has been raised is that the offshore patrol vessels are largely unarmed. So what alternative could there be? So Lursen, along with Navantia, KTM and a range of other shipbuilders are putting some options forward to the Navy as a part of this process at the moment. There's a couple of fantastic things. So hadn't been to Hamburg before. What a fantastic town that is. What an amazing shipyard, a very historical shipyard. Lursen owned the old Blumenvoss shipyard, and I'm sure people might recognise a certain battleship by the name of Bismarck that was built at the Blumenvoss. I actually stood inside the dock where the Bismarck was built and on the lock where she entered the water for the first time. So they have a very long history, over 120 odd years, Lursen, of building ships for Germany, for Europeans and the German Navy. And one of the things they were showing us there was their K-130 corvettes. And the most interesting thing of that was really about the way they'd done it with the German Navy. We've known, Blake can attest to this, there's lots of discussion about shipbuilding in the US Navy and ship design. There is in the Australian Navy as well in that context. And what we saw there was Lursen had built 5 of these corvettes for the German Navy. They were working so well, and due to their increased threat environment from Russia and the war in Ukraine, the German big increases in defence spending, they'd come back to Lursen and said, well, we need warships and we need them quickly. This design has worked fantastically. Just build us 5 more. So they'd done a fixed price contract. They entered that whole process within a year. They laid the first keel down. By the time we got to the shipyard, the first one they called Boat 6, because there's the second batch of 5. Boat 6 was in the water doing sea trials. We went on Boat 7, which was just at the end of its fit out. And we saw all the way down to Boat 10, whose keel was laid in a dock in there. And they're delivering them at a drumbeat of about 1 boat every 7 months. And at a fixed price contract. And what the German Navy said to make this quick and efficient and fast was build us the same boats, don't change the design. And what they said, they had a bit of obsolescence built in there, but that's question of speed to capability and of working with industry as a really close partner. It's a really fantastic example from what I saw there. And then we went down to Bulgaria. Now, Bulgaria, I have to say, it hasn't been on my dance card of where I thought I'd go anytime soon. Another big reason to accept the trip. And in Bulgaria, Lursen's building 2 ships for the Bulgarian Navy called the C-90 Corvette, so it's a larger version of the offshore patrol vessel they're building for us. It's a much more capable vessel. It's got vertical launch cells. It's got a 76mm gun. It's got a number of more capable radar and offensive and defensive weapon systems. And this is what Lursen are pitching as one of the potential options to the Australian Navy for this Tier 2 surface combatant. So it was really interesting to go to the seaside town of Varna on the Black Sea, just across from the Ukraine, to see the way that they're building that vessel and the capability that they have. And Bulgaria is a fascinating place, I have to say. I know Blake spent some time there in his youth, and people were lovely and fantastic. Varna's a seaside town. It was a real mixing pot from people all over Europe that were there largely on holidays. And it was really good to see that sort of capability. So that's going to be an interesting thing that Lursen is pitching to the Australian government that will, I'm sure, be considered alongside Navantia and all the others that Navy will have to make, and Defence will have to make a decision about that speed to capability and the right capable platform for the Australian Navy. But no matter which way direction and Navy goes, I think one of the advantages that I think Lursen just have, which is just obvious, that they have a shipyard in Perth, they have a contract with Defence, they have dock workers, and they have a design. So the question for Defence will be, is that the best way to go, or is another shipbuilder a better way to go?
Yeah, fantastic. That sounds like an excellent trip. You really sold me on Bulgaria. Sounds good. Well, before we go, I'd love to get your by the numbers fact or stat. So Blake, I might start with you. What's your by the numbers?
So it's actually pretty fitting. It dovetails with what Pete was talking about in terms of shipbuilding and dry docks. So I'm working on a project right now looking at the RAN and Australian maritime capability and where the opportunities and challenges lie with working together with U.S. maritime industry and the U.S. Navy. And talking about dry docks, a full 22% of U.S. dry docks are currently out of commission as part of a seismic survey conducted under the Shipyard Infrastructure Optimization Program. So they basically looked at shipyards on a fault line near the Puget Sound and said, hey, in the event of an earthquake, these 4 dry docks would actually probably suffer catastrophic damage and could slide into a sinkhole. So we have to close them until we can figure out, if they're safe to operate or if we need to take them out of commission and conduct some major rectification work. So some follow-on kind of attached numbers. The U.S. has a total of 18 dry docks spread across only 4 public shipyards, 2 public shipyards in the West, 2 on the East Coast. And one of the 4 that is currently closed is the only one that can accommodate a U.S. nuclear-powered aircraft carrier. So at the moment, if we had to dry dock a carrier, we would have to send it to the East Coast of the United States for it to receive dry dock maintenance. So when we're talking about this kind of stuff, I know Australia has its own impressive and robust maritime infrastructure. I know there's a kind of a TBD on the Henderson Dry Dock project announced by the Morrison government. I know, the Garden Island graving dock, the largest of its kind of in the region. But we're talking about these kind of capabilities that we share in common across the alliance. The U.S. right now is dealing with some serious issues that date back to some pretty dated infrastructure. The newest one of those 4 dry docks was actually built before the conclusion of the Vietnam War. The first one was built around the turn of the century. So we're dealing with some unique problems, and we need to figure out how to think about them together if we're going to succeed.
Fantastic. All right, Pete.
I have 3 related numbers for you that are part of my statistics. So 33, 1985, and 1.
Right.
So this was the 33rd AUSMIN that we've had. It is the first to be held in the sunny town of Brisbane. And it dates back 33, it dates all the way back to 1985. So a little bit of my historian hat on here. Before that, we used to have a thing called the ANZUS Council. Of course, then we had a small problem with New Zealand going, a little bit odd and rogue there, according to Australia and the United States. And the ANZUS Council sort of merged when the New Zealanders sort of separated themselves there back in the mid-1980s. It became more of a bilateral relationship, although the treaty is still in place. It still exists under the ANZUS Treaty, but the US-Australia bilateral relationship then became about AUSMIN. The first one of those was in 1985, as I said. So there's been 33 of them, and it's interesting, this is the first one in Brisbane. And Brisbane, I think, is important because we know the Talisman Sabre exercise is going on at the moment. That's largely happening in the Coral Sea, largely happening off the coast of Queensland. It is spread all the way over to Western Australia. So, for instance, I know there's a particular part of the exercise that's being held this week in the far northwest of Western Australia where the US Army will be firing HIMARS rocket systems, which Australia is about to get off the coast of Western Australia, on the coast of Western Australia. But I think Brisbane's important because the principles are met there. It's the kind of epicenter or the closest capital city to where the Talisman Sabre exercises are. But I also would like to think, not having spoken to the principles involved, that it's also a symbol of it being more northern orientated because of the focus that's very much on the DSR, on the Northern Base Network, on the north of Australia from Queensland across to Western Australia is really becoming the epicenter of the military-to-military part of our relationship and cooperation. As I mentioned at the top of the show, the dual investment we're doing into RAAF bases in Sherga and Curtin is going to be really critically important. So I'd like to think that, going as to one of our northernmost capital cities there in Brisbane, in Queensland, was really connected to the Talisman Sabre exercise, and I'm sure gave Secretary Blinton and Secretary Austin the chance to go and visit the US troops that were out participating in the exercise, and also many of the other countries and nations that were involved. So it's a really important time. We might see Brisbane back on the agenda. Most of them have been in Washington, DC or Canberra or Sydney. My former boss, Stephen Smith, managed to sneak one in there in Perth one year. But it's good to see Brisbane get on the dance card of AUSMIN hosts.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, thank you both, Peter and Blake, so much for joining us on the podcast today. You've given us all a lot to think about. As we wrap up, I'd like to point out a couple of other podcasts that may be of interest. So we have our Technology and Security podcast, TS, run by Dr. Mia Hammond-Erry, USSC's Director of Emerging Technology, as well as our USSC Live series that runs recordings from our major live events. Recent episodes include our readout from White House National Security Council staff Kurt Campbell, Edgard Kagan and Mira Rapp-Hooper, an interview with Qantas CEO Alan Joyce and former US Ambassador John Berry, and our researchers' responses to the AUKUS report. And you can find all of these on our website, ussc.edu.au, or listen wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks very much.